Hello, everyone. I'm Joetta Pro, and I'm joined today by Nancy Henry and Marie Inanli. The three of us were some of the group of 10 who participated in uh, the UUA General Assembly in late June. And we're happy to share with you today some thoughts from workshops that we participated in. The general theme, I think, that what we're going to talk about today has to do with how we can make Unitarian Universalism the all-embracing faith that we all want it to be, and what that means for us as individuals and as congregations. So with that brief intro, I'm going to turn it to Nancy, who's going to talk a little bit about some of what she learned in several workshops. Nancy?
Thanks, Joetta. As UUs, we like to think we are fully open to people of all races, ethnicities, gender identities, educational backgrounds, income levels, physical, mental, and emotional abilities. In reality, like most human beings, we don't always live as fully into those moral obligations as we would like. Why is that? Well, we don't have all the answers here, but our experiences at GA taught us a few things, some of which we already knew, some of which was new. One thing we hear over and over these days is that we all have implicit bias. We're often not aware of the stereotypes we have in our consciousness. We don't want to admit to any bias, of course, but I have been paying attention a lot more to my own thoughts and expectations. And yes, I sometimes have stereotypical reactions that flit through my mind as I deal with people different from me. Many of us were raised to be free from prejudice, but we are all surrounded by cultural bias, which is the assumption that our culture is the right one. We do things the right way. Awareness of bias is the first step to not letting implicit bias affect our behavior.
Thank you, Nancy. That's a good starting point for our conversation today. I attended a lot of different workshops, including several that pertain to or that discussed concepts raised by the Commission on Institutional Change, which has produced a report called Widening the Circle of Concern. And I was so inspired by some of the ideas they brought forth that I even wrote down some notes. And I want to read a quote from one of the workshops that I attended. "Ours is a liberatory faith, a faith that liberates us all. We are called together as community and are only saved by the all of us. Operating from this perspective is a moral obligation that we choose when we become UUs." Wow, that statement really felt powerful to me. And it led me to some other questions, or to ponder some other questions, like how do we fully live into the moral obligation of our UU faith? Put another way, if we say that love is a primary foundational belief for us, how do we operationalize that belief? How might love impact how we engage with each other or with the broader community? Does it have implications for us as to how we work together as a congregational community? So we have to keep working and sorting through. These are big picture questions, but they, to me, prompt me to continue processing what I was exposed to and learned at General Assembly. Marie, you want to hit on a couple key points that struck you as really critical from General Assembly this year?
Indeed. Thank you, Joetta. So I know when I grew up that the word was tolerance, that we should be tolerant of other people that were unlike ourselves. To me, now that we know more, we should do more. That is a really low bar. So many people now go beyond that and say, well, I'm not racist. And all that I learned through these workshops and world events make clear that it's not enough to be not actively racist, but in fact, it's important that we, as you use in particular, are allies and bystanders. So part of what the workshops explored is what it means to truly be an ally, and when we need to let the people who really identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color take the lead, and when it's upon us to do the learning and not put the pressure on them to teach us. So that was an important component, and we'll have to look at how we explore those options in our community.
Silence is not enough, and finding out how to use our voices is important, huh?
Indeed.
Yeah. So Nancy, I know you attended a workshop that we've spoken about that was quite interesting and even had an interesting name. What was the name of that workshop again?
Yes, it was called Why We Want But Resist Diversity. Keith Cron was speaking of this as it relates to UUs in our churches. Reverend Cron has worked for the UUA for 25 years. He developed this model years ago and has applied it to many of the situations we face as UUs. How can we integrate into our community folks who are different from us? Specifically this time, he was talking about attracting more Black and brown people to our congregations. When it comes to welcoming visitors of different races or ethnicities, when it comes to inviting them to remain in our community, Reverend Cron says that our congregations are composed of 5 different sets of people. Let me explain. First, some people refuse to believe that we need to change. They don't think there's any work to be done. Everything is fine the way it is. We don't need to rock the boat. Marie?
Nope.
Oh, well, that sounds like a really laissez-faire attitude.
A second group of people would say, yes, let's make our congregation more diverse. However, when newcomers arrive, this group wants them to act and talk like us. We want them to adapt to us, to our community.
I mean, you know, this is our church, and if you want to be a member, you kind of have to fit into our church the way it is, right?
Those in the next group claim to want diversity as well, as long as they don't have to change. You can be yourself, but I am fine just the way I am. The fourth group is the one that recognizes that we all need to change. We have work to do if we are going to be a diverse congregation. And then there's a final group. It's a small set of individuals who want overnight change. They don't want to take time to work at it. Sadly, though, these people are often preachy and strident, and they can turn others in the congregation away from the necessary process. Now, of these 5 groups, I was surprised, according to Keith Cron, the largest group in most UU congregations is usually the group that is welcoming, that does want diversity, but only as long as the new folks don't stand out, as long as they fit into our present power structure. Of course, this made me consider St. John's. Is this the majority in our church? If so, what do we need to do? I know Joetta has some thoughts on this limited level of commitment, and I know Marie has thoughts on how we will move forward to become more inclusive.
So Nancy, what you described kind of reminded me of an experience I had, not at St. John's, but at another UU congregation years ago before we moved to the Cincinnati area. My then partner, because we weren't yet able to be married, my partner and I went to the church, and we found that we were we felt sort of tolerated, to use Marie's word, or it was okay for us to be a part of the church, but we felt really kind of invisible. And that was the words that I used at the time. I felt accepted but invisible. And I think that sort of fits with some of what you were talking about. So that came to mind for me today. Thanks, Nancy, for telling us about that important workshop, which will be food for thought and maybe conversation among people who watch this video. So, okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit now about something else that is hopefully food for conversation, because it has to do with learning new language. Part of how I personally find that I embrace my UU faith and try to help myself to grow is by paying attention to language and how it can stretch and challenge me. Sometimes I kind of resist that. It's hard to accept words like white supremacy culture and systemic racism, and to recognize that those are not only valid, but also that they need to be acknowledged by me as a white person and by other white people in order to help lay the groundwork for a better world and for true justice. But those words are hard. It is hard to remain open to that latest terminology, and yet I need to hear it and learn it. Marie referenced Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and we have learned that a new acronym for that, which is BIPOC, and I kind of liken it to LGBTQ. It's an acronym that captures a lot and is a useful tool for conversation. And so I've started to try to use that when I'm referring to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and it makes sure I kind of capture the full breadth of that. I think in the other small group conversation, you'll hear some language that may be different for you too, talk about colonialism and so forth. So, you know, these words are just words, and they are words that may mean something. During one of the meetings that I attended of the Allies for Racial Equity, someone wrote in the chat, because remember, this was all online, GA, and we had Zoom meetings and we had active chat conversations going while the presenters were talking. It was a lot to take in. It was like 2 tracks simultaneously. And so in the chat notes during that Allies for Racial Equity meeting, someone wrote, well, why do we need to use BIPOC? And I replied that first of all, it's what people have asked us to use, people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And it's sort of like how I really prefer that people call me by my full first name and not try to make it a nickname, which people occasionally try to do, and that they pronounce my last name properly, which nobody guesses unless they are told. But if they know, and if they do that, that feels respectful to me. So that kind of learning about language, about our history, about preferred pronouns, all of that sort of thing for me, serves as a platform to be better prepared to do racial justice work. And all of that was really reinforced by General Assembly this time around. So Marie, you want to talk a little bit about some of the workshops that you went to in your role as a religious education expert for us?
Certainly. Well, I certainly can relate to the experience of having a name, at least a last name, that's not particularly common. and understanding that just by looking at it, many people don't know how to say it. So it's my job to help them out. But I certainly do appreciate when people make the effort to try and not just use a nickname to make it easy. That has certainly happened to at least one of my children. Also with language, I know that I've been challenged particularly with the pronoun they. I can still hear, you know, Sister Boniface in my ear, that that's a plural pronoun, never singular. So what really motivated me to change is when I was in the car riding to my now daughter-in-law's bridal shower, and one of her attendants preferred the pronoun they. So she was explaining this to me on the way. And of course, Liz is somebody who's dear to me, so I wanted to do my level best to be respectful of her and her dear friend. So it's like, okay, I really need to slow down and think, right? Because that's what it takes, not being on autopilot. That's what many actions or words that are perceived are rude. It's just a lack of awareness and taking the time to be informed and show that new knowledge and caring. So when I attended a workshop that was in fact a report, a sharing of the learnings from the Commission on Institutional Change, there were indeed a number of religious educators who were very actively chatting as the presentation went on. And the presenters were letting us know that the UUA is committed to developing curricula to meet people where they are. So that is at various points of entry, because we don't all have the same experiences. For instance, I grew up in New York City when I was very young. I was used to a very diverse culture from the get-go, but I know that's not everybody's experience. So besides that, there was mention that using OWL as a model, that is that facilitators would be trained to not only deliver content, but to have heart-to-heart conversations. Because after all, as Joetta, you mentioned, some of these conversations are difficult and it requires some care to really not just do surface talk. Pronouns are a good place to start, but really to listen with an open heart, to understand people's personal experiences and have ongoing conversations so we can build a trusting relationship. So like Joetta, when you felt tolerated instead of fully embraced and welcomed, did you feel free to speak up?
Not initially. I mean, I was just trying to find my way in a new congregation, you know?
Right, and you know, to be frank, we know that you're not a shrinking wallflower, right? So,
Not typically.
so
it does show what the impact is whenever you're the outsider trying to come in, you know?
Indeed, and many people know that I have traveled overseas where I have felt like the outsider. So it really takes effort from the group to not only tolerate, but welcome and champion the cause of others to make them feel welcome. And I know many people at St. John's belong to other organizations and committees where they actively do work with those other organizations, but there certainly is work to be done within St. John's to understand how we can be more fully welcoming. So the program that I alluded to would emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion of all people, having conversations, diving deep into some new curricula, and indeed training folks to facilitate those conversations. So although that curricula isn't ready yet, and that also will be something that our new committee that Reverend Mitra and the board is building to look at these issues will need to investigate, because we have congregational polity and we need to see what fits for us in the work that our congregants are already doing. But I invite each of you to think about what your role might be if you're interested in being a facilitator, how you might be an ally, and stay connected as we learn more and do more to make St. John's a truly welcoming congregation on another level. And in fact, the UAA is looking at perhaps having a certification similar to the welcoming congregation, but specifically speaking on issues surrounding people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color.
Thank you, Marie. And you know, you used another phrase that we heard a lot at General Assembly that I want to highlight before we wrap up here, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes you hear that as equity, inclusion, diversity, or inclusion, diversity, equity, the three words in different order, but those three words really capture a lot. And I invite everyone at St. John's to start thinking about the use of those words, because they convey a lot. And you can read more about that in the Commission on Institutional Change report or in various resources online. We invite you finally, as we wrap up here, to keep learning, to stretch yourself, to challenge yourself, to go beyond what's comfortable, because now is a moment to do that. Now is really the time. There's so much opportunity for us to all learn, so many resources to use to expand our knowledge so that we are better able to act in support of racial justice and a better community for all of us. So
I agree, Joetta. And along those lines of terminology, another focus was using the term anti-oppression, which is broader and more inclusive than anti-racist, as important as that is, particularly at the moment. But we all know that people are oppressed for multiple reasons.
That's right. Yeah. Nancy, thank you. Marie, thank you. It's been a good conversation, fun preparing this and providing this for St. John's, and we hope that it's a benefit to our members and friends. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.